Welcome to the GSMC Pets Podcast, the show that caters to pet lovers of all kinds. We'll talk about pets on social media, pets doing amazing things, and how to take care of the pets in your life. Whether your pet is a dog, a cat, a llama, hamster, reptile, or something more exotic, you'll find educational and entertaining information on the GSMC Pets Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the GSMC Pets Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Alex Fletes. So today, I would love to talk to you guys about some animals we don't really get to discuss, the playful ones. You know, animals that have a high energy, they just want to have fun, because animals just want to have fun. We've talked about our exotic animals. We've talked about more wild animals, conservation between them. Should this animal be a pet or not? Well, let's just have a little fun today and talk about the animals who just want to have fun. So, in a recent report I just saw, I realized that there were a group of sea otters. Sea otters that made their way onto a deck at an Audubon Institute in Florida. And it is honestly one of the most adorable things I have ever seen. This group of sea otters these are river otters. They made their way into the exhibit and they slid up onto the deck and just started playing. They were jumping around, climbing on each other, having a lot of fun. They were all still wet, so they looked like they just got out of the water. It was super adorable. They're chirping. All the cute squeaks they make, it was really cute. You just saw like a big puddle of dark brown fur, and like you see little heads pop up every once in a while. At first I thought it was a video of some eels, but then when their heads started popping up, they were adorable. And if you've ever taken a chance to see some sea otters, they are very fascinating creatures, but they're also some of the most playful creatures. There's really a lot of fascinating things about sea otters and river otters. One thing is that with river otters, they actually are very adaptable to a lot of modern city-like areas. If you've ever gone to maybe like your local park or maybe rivers, and like if you have like a river running through your area, maybe take a look around. You might be lucky and see a river otter near your area. But I myself, we have a very large river running through one of our biggest cities. And not that long ago, I actually took a trip out to the water, and I happened to see a river otter right in broad daylight. And this is in a very city-based area. And I just saw a river otter out of nowhere. At first, I thought it was driftwood. Maybe it could have been like a big snake. But no, it popped up, had whiskers and everything. Dove back underwater in a few seconds and came back with some food in its mouth. It was really fascinating what these creatures are capable of. So if you ever get the chance to see creatures like that, I really do recommend it, because their mobility and what they're capable of is really fascinating. So if you've ever held a ferret, which are also very fun animals, but also very snippy and also a little, they're a little mean, but they're still sweet in their own way. Ferrets are interesting animals, but most people call them a living noodle, a fuzzy living noodle. Living noodle is pretty much snakes. River otters are basically like sea ferrets, and sea ferrets are, well, adorable. The way they move in the water is actually a really fascinating, display, simply because they don't just move by swimming. They have, sort of like webbed toes, or, they have their pads, but they're complete mammals, so they spend most of their time in the water, but they actually have really cool ways of moving around. They actually will twist their whole body in a, like, spinning motion to move in the air, which is actually similar to, like, if you ever see like pilots dogfighting in the air in their planes, this is very similar motions, but it's really cool to watch them because they're not swimming with fins, gills, a aquatically designed body. Rather, they're moving in ways that they bend their whole body, twirl around. It's really, really cool, and these little cuties are fast too. These are very underrated creatures, but they're also lovable, very sweet, adorable, and they're very, very smart. They're very intuitive. One of the most fascinating things that they do is they actually, if they're trying to open up something like a oyster or a clam, they actually will get things like either rocks, hard trash, or even other oysters, and they will smash them together until one of them breaks and eat what's inside, which is very rare for animals to do in general because the use of tools is usually reserved for, higher intellect, and I put quotation marks on this, higher intellect creatures to maneuver with. Even apes and simians are capable of this, but there's very few animals that are capable of this. The only other two besides apes I can think of are sea otters and occasionally crows. And crows are a whole other story, but I'll get to them one day. But along with that, I'm sure there are several others, but this is one of the most fascinating ones. These little things are sweet. They sleep when in the water too. It's really, they're really cute creatures. There's so many fun, energetic creatures that don't get a lot of attention simply because either they're underlooked or maybe you're not going to see them very often in your area, or simply because they get overshadowed by something a little more popular, because that's sometimes how we view animal kingdoms, is by popularity. You know, there's so many fascinating animals out there that they get overlooked for something that's uber cute, or that one well-known animal that everyone just likes for no reason. But honestly, sea otters are adorable. They're high energy. This video is super cute of just these little things are just jumping all over the dock like they have not a care in the world. They're super sweet. You know, I'm not going to contest to whether how dangerous they are or not, but I will tell you about the next animal coming up. I really want to talk to you guys about some animals that I did get to work with and can tell you a lot more about from my hands-on. And it's going to be animals like sea lions. A lot of aquatic life, honestly, has a lot of energy. There's a lot of energy out in the water. A lot of people just don't know that simply because how many of you actually spend more than a day in the water? That's really an interesting something to consider, how many people actually spend time in the water, because you're missing a large chunk of our ecosystem out there. Crabs are even pretty energetic little creatures if you give them a chance. But for as many fish as we have in the water, we have just as many mammals or creatures that just simply spend time in the water. Heck, if you've ever seen an octopus in motion, wow, those things are so cool. But with the sea otters and river otters, and a lot of small mammals and things that people would consider rodents, like nutrias and beavers, they're actually very fun, energetic creatures. One that I'm going to tell you, very, very fascinating fact, armadillos. They hop. Armadillos hop like bunnies, and it's actually really, really fascinating. I'm going to tell you more about that soon enough. But if you guys get the chance, maybe spend some time out at your local river, maybe your local park, anywhere that has a nice body of water, and maybe you'll be lucky enough and get to see a river otter. It would be honestly a great treat. And also, if you do go by the water, please don't feed the ducks bread. Rather, feed them fruit, or maybe even seeds. Feed them things that are much more appropriate, because it is not good to feed ducks bread. It is bad for them, makes them sick. So you have better options. Just letting you know that now. But definitely, I recommend spending some time near the water if you want to try seeing some unique animals you don't usually get to see. But in just a moment, we are going to go on break because I need to go and consolidate with some of our advertisers. But as soon as we get back, we're going to talk about sea lions. Oh yeah. Stay tuned. This is the GSMC Pet Podcast.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed those commercials. I know I sure did. Also, a fun fact, a group of otters is called a romp. And that's certainly what these guys did, I can tell you what. So, as we previously discussed, sea otters and river otters, adorable, fun, energetic creatures who, honestly, if you get the chance to observe them, are incredibly fascinating and very intelligent too. But now I'm shifting over to another type of animal, also sea-based, very energetic, and very adorable, sea lions. And yes, there is a huge difference between a sea lion and a seal. Seals are more rotund and spherical, and they tend to live in much colder environments, whereas sea lions actually live in a lot more cityscapes out or just off of cities. So a lot of times, if you're a surfer and maybe off the course of say Florida or even out in the South, if you're anywhere near the coast, really, you might see some sea lions out in the water. California sea lions and the like are very common out there. So a lot of times, surfers might run into these guys. They're actually not very dangerous, but they're also not the safest either. They are curious creatures. They're very energetic. They're very curious and playful, but they also can be a little aggressive if they feel threatened. They actually don't. They have sharp teeth, so that's something to worry about because they do hunt for fish. And they're very fast swimmers, but they are also slightly dangerous if threatened, or if, let's just say, much like a 50 to 80 pound dog, they get really energetic and they decide to jump, they can take you down pretty quickly. But I myself actually did spend quite a lot of time with some sea lions. When I first started working at my nature institute, the first place I was put was the sea lion exhibit. Now, I mean, that doesn't mean I was immediately put in charge of the sea lions. More or less, I was composing the diets for them. But I did get to spend some time with them one-on-one. And this is where I actually found a lot of respect for why nature institutes do this. You may think, oh, they're just scooping out animals out of the wild and putting them in cages. No, they're not doing that. What they typically do is they find animals who are injured, abused, who have some kind of issue, and they can't be sent back into the wild. A good example are some of these sea lions who, if you looked at them closely, you'd see some of the areas where they'd been previously in fights, or perhaps some who were missing eyes because, they were attacked off the coast or something, and it would be really difficult for them to return back into the wild without proper treatment. So the goal of most nature institutes is to house an animal, keep them in an environment that can at least somewhat mimic their original environment until they're healthy enough to get back into the environments, into the water or into the jungle or wherever they belong, and then when they're healthy enough, release them back. But if it's impossible to release them back for one reason or another, then they'll usually hold on to them and help them keep a longer life. So that's why there's a big difference between Nature Institute and zoo. It just depends on how they decide to treat and house these creatures. But back to the point, a lot of these sea lions were really amazing, very, very flexible. The ability for them to reach back and touch their tails with their toes was, with their nose, was really fascinating. Very loud and playful creatures, and they're very gentle, but they still do require a level of training to really get to spend time with them. But they are very playful creatures, but they do not make good pets. I can already tell you that much. One of them will probably weigh about as much as you do. But people have dubbed them the doggos of the sea, and I think that's pretty accurate. Especially, if they're more familiar around people, again, beach lions. If they're more familiar around people, they can be very adorable creatures, but they still are technically wild animals that you should be on the lookout for. So if any of my listeners out there are surfers, surf fanatics, or just very frequently in the water, they'd also know that there is a negative connotation to being around sea lions a lot, and that is one of their main predators, say sharks or occasionally whales. Mainly sharks because of their carnivorous nature. If anyone is actively in the water, they should know that one of the main dangers of being a surfer is, while it doesn't happen often, potential shark attacks. And it's negative being a surfer simply because from under the water, the shape of the board and the movement of a surfer's arms when they're paddling out, if you look at it from under with the silhouette, it does make the surfer look more like a sea lion. So if you look at the body shape, the tail, the roundness of it, it will make you as a surfer look like a sea lion. And that's dangerous because it can make you a potential target. But again, the amount of shark bites that happen are actually very low. I believe there are more people who die by cow than people that die by shark attacks. But it is just a fun, interesting fact that also it's a bit of a warning as well, because sea lions are adorable creatures, fascinating creatures, lovely comedical creatures too. They're very silly, but they do present some danger if you're actually in the water pursuing them. But there are other similar events of sea lions being resourceful and being very welcome around humans, such as this one amazing video I remember of a small crew who is in like inflatable rafts or kayaks, and they're in somewhere up north, and then a sea lion just jumps into their raft. Like it was swimming, and it just like immediately jumped out of the water, got on their raft, and then just stayed there, stood completely still. And the guys are like, "What the heck? What are you doing?" And then as they did that, a large orca, big whale, moved under their boat, like their fin, like kind of brushed under their boat and everything, because it was chasing the sea lion. It was really amazing, and also shows again some of those potential dangers. So it was just fascinating. No one did anything. Everyone was just surprised that it happened. The sea lion was waiting its time, avoiding potential snack time. But it was really amazing, just kind of like how they can be comfortable around people, but they typically don't, because they don't need people, but they might sometimes need people. But the level of, hey, I'm in danger, help me out, you kind of saw in the sea lion's face, was pretty impressive. So I definitely wouldn't say sea lions are pets, but I definitely think they are a lot more familiar and accustomed with people than you realize. I'm not saying right now you need to go out and find a sea lion, make best friends with it, and have fun, but rather respect the nature and be warned that there be sea lions out there, and they do come with a lot of positives and negatives. They're sweet creatures. Take a trip to your local aquarium or your zoo and get to observe these creatures. They are something else, and they are slapping. That's also one of my favorite tricks they ever will do, is like you get them on their side and they start clapping for themselves. It's very fun. Also, a neat thing about sea lions is when they can't see, they actually have these really thick bristles on their face that let them feel. So it's like they have tiny fingers on their face that let them feel around under the water. It's kind of cool when you get to learn about it. Again, take a trip out to the aquarium or the zoo. They got a lot of really interesting creatures out there. But we are about to go on yet another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some more fun, friendly animals out there, and a lot of really high energetic animals, things that you maybe don't get to experience too much of. I want to talk about some more semi-aquatic animals, and I think we'll talk about one very semi-aquatic animal very soon. But until then, enjoy these messages.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Just talked about the dangers of being around a sea lion, the fun about being around a sea lion, and what you should know if you ever decide to spend time around them, specifically what dangers are presented to you, the natural predators, and also surf safety. But now I want to talk to you all about another very famous semi-aquatic animal. Now, we've talked about sea lions and otters, very adorable animals in their own rights, very popular and very misunderstood. But there is one animal that is very, very misunderstood and was thankfully popularized and brought attention by the hit Disney Channel show Phineas and Ferb. That's right, we're talking about the platypus. Now, platypus, or platypi, platypeople, those things. If you don't really remember what a platypus looks like, it's honestly an enigma of the animal kingdom because it has the body of somewhat like a beaver with a beaver tail somewhat, webbed feet, and a duckbill. Now, it's also one of the few, actually the only mammal that lays eggs. So it does beg the question of what a platypus really is. But you know, if you do enough research, you can find that out yourself. But a platypus seems to be just one of those interesting, I guess, exceptions to the basic, zoology we've learned as, that we learned as kids. It's a fascinating creature, and it's cool because it's very interesting to watch in the water because it, just moves around like a, it moves like a fish, kind of. It's really hard to explain it without really being able to show you what's so fascinating about it. But it is just about the only animal, the mammal, that can lay eggs. If you saw it in the water, you might not even be able to tell it's a platypus. But it just looks basically like a beaver with a duckbill. Apparently, it's also semi-poisonous as well, which makes it a little more fascinating. Let's see. When it comes to the platypus, some people say it's also an amphibious mole, which is even more fascinating about it. And again, the webbed foot is kind of the interesting part. This could be something similar to a beaver, a nutria, or even a sea otter, but instead it also has webbed footing. So it looks, in some areas, if you look at it in the right area, in the right position, it actually does look like a duck, sometimes just a really chubby duck. But it's really fascinating. But they have features from, well, mammals, ducks. They even have features from reptiles as well. It's really interesting. And they also are knuckle walkers. Knuckle walking is interesting because there aren't a ton of animals that do this. Another animal I can really think of would probably be the echidna. And I think anteaters also do this as well. No, aardvarks. Anteaters don't walk on their knuckles, but aardvarks do. So if you were to walk on all fours, and instead of using your hand flat to walk, you walked on your knuckles, that's what these things would be doing. It's really fascinating because these creatures are an honest enigma, but somehow it works. It's kind of like if you went in your pantry and your refrigerator, you got 2 pieces of bread, and then you just kind of took whatever you found and made it into a sandwich, and it looked like a sandwich, and it tasted like a sandwich, but it wasn't completely a sandwich. I mean, you threw meatballs and olives in there, but then you also kind of threw in, like, some fish, and then you threw in lettuce, but then barbecue sauce, and yet it somehow worked. That's kind of the weird part, right? But I like it. I find the platypus interesting. And I think I'm thankful that, cartoons have the ability to bring to a whole generation a acknowledgement of something that may not really be known. So with the advent of Phineas and Ferb, which was one of Disney's most successful and longest-running animated series, they introduced the character of Perry the Platypus, who was a secret agent platypus, but for some reason was also blue. Now, I mean, blue is not a bad color, but it is definitely not accurate to real life. Also not accurate in the show is the sound that Perry the Platypus makes, that sort of crickling noise. Actually was created by voice actor D. Bradley Baker, who plays Perry the Platypus. So I don't think that's exceptionally accurate to how platypi sound. But what there are some interesting facts about platypi are that they are, aside from dolphins, one of those few species that use electroperception. Basically, instead of using whiskers or echolocation or sight, they actually can use electric fields around them to sense where their enemies are or prey or anything they're looking for, which is, again, one of those weird sandwich things about a platypus. They have all of these interesting things about them, but they don't seem like they should go together. It's really weird. Again, the beaver tail, which I guess does help it propel forward, but it also has webbed feet. It's really interesting. And if you get the chance to go and look at these creatures, they are really fascinating. They're also somewhat related to echidnas, which, if you don't know what an echidna is, go play Sonic and Knuckles. That'll help you out. But if you don't, they kind of are like not spiky. They're kind of like not spiky porcupines. But they're not exactly like beavers or moles. They're interesting. They're interesting creatures. But platypi, I don't know why they fascinate me so much, because it's something that shouldn't work but just does. Because they're not very common. It's interesting. And it's interesting also that apparently, like I said, they're venomous. Snakes in our last episode are venomous. Frogs are poisonous. There aren't a lot of non-reptilian creatures that are venomous, but platypi are. They have sort of little spiked barbs, almost like they're a punk kid going through the rebellious phase. They put some spike bracelets on, and then they give you a little stick, and they're gonna poison you. But no, they have little spike barbs around their flippers, their fins, and they can have very small amounts of venom. but apparently only the males will have venom, so that's something extra. It's interesting. Honestly, if we were talking about Pokemon, this would be a very interesting Pokemon type, but we're not here nor there. One day, I will get there. But for right now, I think that it's important to learn about these interesting creatures, because if we don't know about things so mysterious to us, well, we consider this to be some kind of magic or freak against nature. It's completely nature, and it's very cool. And I've seen platypi in person. They are pretty cool. I mean, other than the features added on them, they're not anything outrageous, but they are still very fascinating animals. And if the Disney Channel show has given us any type of, indication of how interesting platypi are, then I'd say go take some time and go to your local institute and see if you can learn a thing or two about them. Along with that, I just find them to be neat. I think they're cool. They are in conservation mode because we don't want anything to happen to these little guys. I know I don't. So if you honestly go to a conservation resort, you probably can find yourself some kind of platypi sanctuary. Apparently in Australia there are some. So if you ever take a trip down under, go see your little web-footed, big-billed friends. Because I know I sure will next chance I'm in the land down under. But until then, guys, we are going to take another quick break, and when we come back, we'll discuss more animals, semi-aquatic or not, that definitely deserve some spotlight. Perhaps they're a little kooky, a little crazy, or perhaps they're just plain silly. We'll be back after these messages.
Is weird, odd, strange, or just plain bizarre is really your cup of tea? Then, the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast will give you that fix. Can't believe it? Well, listen for yourself as we deliver the strangest news you definitely won't find on CNN or Fox. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast.
Hello and welcome back. Now, we just recently talked about the enigma that is the platypus, the interesting facts behind it, the fact that it lays eggs and has venom, and the fact of its recent surge of popularity, and just why you should see this little guy in action. But our next creature is tiny, toony, just a bit loony, very kooky, and is in fact real. It's the Tasmanian Devil. Now, much like our previous topic, the Tasmanian Devil is a real creature, popularized in fiction and media by the Tasmanian Devil character in Looney Tunes, Taz, the Tasmanian Devil. But, unlike its fictional counterpart, the Tasmanian Devil does not spin around like a wild tornado, snarling, spitting, and consuming/destroying anything in its path. Rather, it's just a simple marsupial. So what is true is that they do actually come from the land of Tasmania, or rather, it's an island state of Tasmania, which is mainly off the main coast of the Marina Island. But they are dwindling in numbers. They are indeed an endangered species. Unfortunately, they are endangered due to an unfortunate disease that I'll get into in just a little bit. But there are some interesting facts. It's a carnivorous marsupial, so much like, say, kangaroos, opossums, it's relatively harmless other than it eats meat. It's very small. In fact, if you look at this thing, it looks like a bear got shrunk in the dryer, and then it got a long tail like a otter. So it's actually pretty cute to look at, and also very, very interesting enigma in itself. So with this, the Tasmanian Devil honestly doesn't have that much serious, doesn't have too much of a serious track record of anything too unusual. They were attempted to be domesticated, but that didn't turn out well. They are a bit aggressive, though. That is one thing about these creatures, is that they can be aggressive. In fact, they're especially aggressive when it comes to mates, because once they find a mate, they actually very aggressively will, protect their mates and for dominance. So these things, they are very territorial. So perhaps that's where we got our modern interpretation of how the Tasmanian devil acts, but it still is it's a very small creature. It does grow in some size, but it is still very small. Probably not going to get much bigger than, say, your average house dog. They are very, very small creatures, but they are very, very aggressive, and they probably could really inflict some damage onto a adult male or an adult anything if provoked enough. So the Tasmanian devil is also a bit of an enigma in itself. For one thing, these things can run almost 10 miles an hour. They are incredibly fast for their size. They are thick and stocky, but yet they are also relatively quick. And a very interesting fact is how strong their bite is. They have one of the strongest bites relative to their size. Their bites are strong enough that they could relatively tear through meat, rip and crush bones, and actually bite through metal wire, which is not too far off from what the cartoony Tasmanian devil is usually shown to do. Perhaps which is where we get this same, description of the creature. Let's see. It looks like their bite force is somewhere around 553 newtons of force. Very, very powerful. Now, they aren't slashing creatures or, they aren't apex predators that are able to take on any creature, but they seem to be small, intimidating creatures. Unlike, say, opossums or, other marsupials that are more scavengers, these guys are actual hunters. And they are just little angry people. There's a reason these things are called the devils, because they don't exactly they are predators, but they're also prey. They have an impressive bite strength, and they actually do take on some predators bigger than themselves. I've never seen a creature quite like this. The unfortunate thing about the devil is that simply, although they are small, little aggressive creatures, they are somewhat dying out, not because of overhunting or even loss of environment, although that is part of it, because there are a nice amount that actually do not make it simply because of motorists, but it's actually because Tasmanian devils had contracted a disease called the devil facial tumor disease, or DFTD, and it's actually reducing the population. It's very fascinating, and these creatures are actually now into protection and conservation motives, because it's a very, very, very unique species. However, they're simply dying out because of a disease, which will be honestly just terrible to happen to a species like this. These species, while not exactly, they're not absolutely like the most celebrated species, they are still a very unique species. And, I mean, they actually don't exactly have the best relation with humans either. But it still is very unique that this kind of thing would happen. I mean, heck, in a lot of reports, it's actually said that Tasmanian devils will attack and or eat recently deceased humans in the wild if found, because of their carnivorous natures. However, that seems to be a little bit more of a exaggeration on most people's parts. But it's been pretty fascinating. The Tasmanian devil actually, has had some very interesting relations with humans, even believing that they had a part in World War I, tried to carry out some testing with that. Very interesting. But one thing that is interesting is that apparently Tasmanian devil milk is being researched for its potential to resist superbugs. That's something kind of interesting. Apparently, the milk of a very aggressive animal can resist superbugs. So, all creatures have some unique, trait or benefit, not just to people, but into the world. And it's fascinating that such a creature that is seen more as a joke or an inconvenience by us humans due to media or to such an aggressive name or the fact that they are aggressive creatures. It's very fascinating. It's very fascinating that there is actually more to these creatures. I really would like to take some time to get to study these kind of creatures myself if I ever get the chance. I know if I get a chance to go to Australia, there are several animals I want to study out there. And I definitely know there are more that I can discuss in the future that I'm willing to share. And if you are interested, you're welcome to submit ideas or for animals I should talk about next. But I will take a quick break, and I will let you all hear a word from these messages while I go and test my bite strength. Until then, enjoy these messages.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back again. As I'm sure you've heard, we have some really awesome other podcasts you should definitely check out if you enjoyed this one. But since you are here right now, let's talk about some more animals. Now, we did just talk about the Tasmanian devil and its surprisingly aggressive nature for such a small creature. But you know what else is surprisingly aggressive for such a small and very laughable and enjoyable creature? The kookaburra. Now, you may know this little creature from that fun little nursery rhyme of the kookaburra sitting in the old gum tree. Very silly, very fun song. But what you may not know is that it's actually a lot more of a aggressive bird than you realize. First things first, a kookaburra is a bird of prey. That is very surprising for me, especially considering the size of this little thing. It's not a very large bird, but it can grow very, very large. I myself have had some in-person contact with a kookaburra, and their sound is very, very infectious. You just love the sound of that kooky cry, but what surprises me is just how, well, I guess the reputation that the kookaburra has going with it. I guess we're kind of stuck in Australia right now because it also is located in Australia and New Guinea. Now, what is interesting about this is that they belong to a larger group of birds known as kingfishers. Kingfishers, as in, they are birds that have long, sharp beaks and short legs, but they also do have the ability to live near rivers and eat fish, hence kingfishers. So if you actually look at these birds, they literally kind of look like spears, flying spears, and that's honestly pretty cool. Now, they are a very, very well-known species of birds, but what is fascinating of them is that they all have something very unique or very special about each and every needs, and the kookaburra is one of them. they're almost exclusively carnivorous, which is very different for birds in general. Unless they are large birds of prey, a lot of them are pretty omnivore or herbivore, usually eating seeds or bugs. But this one, besides eating bugs, it does eat small mice, snakes, insects, and small reptiles, and even other birds if need be. So that's what's really surprising about that very, very, very infectious laughter. In fact, it almost reminds me a bit of something like the Joker, that kooky laugh you might hear as you're walking through the forest. It almost becomes a sinister laugh when you really stop and listen to it. But it's very fascinating. Now, it's very cool because they're also very smart birds. They also, besides, being kingfishers and living near water, which, believe it or not, kookaburras rarely eat fish, despite being carnivorous. Rather, they might steal your goldfish from a pond if you have any, or they'll hang out near a zoo and steal food. But they actually will even hang out near barbecues and steal meat, and that's honestly kind of funny. But it's really not advised to try feeding these guys anything because they need specific meats to stay healthy. They're also extremely territorial, and they are what I like to call I like to call them chorus kids gone bad, where basically they actually will sit together in a chorus of birds and actually sing really loudly to mark their territory. So if you hear a large orchestra of kookaburras out in the wild, they're marking their territory. They're making sure that they know this is our spot. It's kind of like if you and a roaming gang of musical theater kids just kind of went and sung on a street corner aggressively at people, snapping like in West Side Story. It's a little bit like that, and it's pretty fun. Kookaburras are honestly least concerned too, so they're not even endangered. There just must be so many of them, and they're just singing their hearts out, letting them know, hey, back off, bub. This is our street corner. It's our branch. Stay away from our mice. It's kind of funny to me when you think about it. But they're also pretty famous too. If you've ever seen a jungle movie, documentary, even Disney rides, if you ever hear them, you'll hear them kookaburras in the background. So it's just kind of fun to me that we hear a silly laughter, but in reality, those kookaburras are probably a little more aggressive than you realize, and that's what's surprising about it. If you've ever maybe, listened to, say, like, the Jungle Cruise at Disney World, and you hear loud birds in the background, you hear that loud, wah, like, almost monkey-like sounding of a laughing bird. It's a kookaburra. Very famous, very impressive and well-known, but also incredibly, incredibly territorial. It kind of makes you think. It's a good example of a don't judge a book by its cover, or don't judge a song by its melody. Look more into it. I mean, I still love these birds, and I think that they are very interesting, but that's honestly a really, really fascinating take on those birds. They're also very famous, especially in Australia, besides having like a lot of cartoon characters or children's book characters that are kookaburras in a lot of places. Different Australian cartoons, like a series called Splat-A-Lot, which has a kookaburra named Kook, I believe. Or there's Australian radio stations which have characters. There's so many of them. Just looking them up, it's fascinating. You'll hear kookaburra cries in a lot of movies. Even Wizard of Oz has them in there. It's fascinating if you actually take some time to listen to the sound design, how often you'll probably hear these birds around. My local animal sanctuary used to have some of these, but then they finally moved them away because there wasn't really any space for them, and it wasn't in rehabilitation anymore. So it was a pretty good thing they moved it out, but it probably also would be doing better in the real world, in the wild, than in captivity. But it really is fascinating seeing how famous these birds are, while at the same time a lot of the connotation below them as well. It's fascinating. you look at these birds, they do have a very thick, sharp beak, but the way that they're hunters, they're very unassuming birds is kind of what I want to get across to you. I know I can't show it to you right now, but if you do take some time to look up a kookaburra, they are definitely kooky birds because they have very colorful feathers. They have, very cute looks to them. Like, honestly, if you didn't know any better, you'd think this would be a shoulder bird or something. But honestly, they are incredibly, impressive birds. They are just interesting. And if you haven't heard a kookaburra's laugh, you sit there and listen to it for a moment and tell me you don't get this sense of, like, this infectious laughter, and then put it side by side with the Joker's laugh, and you might kind of start to feel you might need to call this bird something else. I definitely find it interesting. I love animals who can really transcend into culture and just kind of become a part of everything we do, or just be there without needing to be like, oh yeah, that's exactly what that is. Sometimes you just know about it. It's like, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. I enjoy these animals. I love birds. They're probably one of my favorite species of animal. And getting the time to get to learn more about these kind of animals is really fascinating to me. There are so many fascinating birds out there that I could talk about. I mean, I already know some interesting facts about flamingos, and I'm definitely going to make an episode about it one day. So if you're interested, definitely leave me a comment. But other than that, it's fascinating to me just how we do things about birds, what we know about them, what we don't. And the kookaburra is just one of those birds that you just really take for granted until you get to see it in person. You get to see that belly laugh, but then you look a little closer, it's like, wow, that is not what I expected. And I definitely think that's the same for people or for a lot of other pets and animals as well. But as always, it's my job to educate and to just encourage people to do a little more research and look beyond what we already know, just to really appreciate the diversity of animals. But while you take a moment to reflect on that, I'm going to send you off with a word from our sponsors while we get things settled for the last segment of this podcast. I am just kind of discuss a lot of other kooky animals that we didn't get to talk about. But until then, enjoy these messages.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
And once again, welcome back, fellow animal lovers. I hope you enjoyed that message. So we previously talked about the very interesting kookaburras, their infectious, possibly sinister laughter. And as we continue forward, I simply want to discuss just other animals we may not know about, or just don't get a lot of attention, or really haven't been observed, and just some of my favorite animals I just haven't gotten to talk about today. Starting off that list is simply ostriches. I find ostriches to be some of the, I guess, not enigmas, but just sort of the odd man out when it comes to, birds and other avian creatures, simply because they are birds. However, they can't fly, yet they have wings. They're large. They're not exactly carnivorous. Rather, they are omnivores. But they are interesting as that they've adapted more to their environment for running rather than flying, since flying probably isn't in the need of, their environment. Similarly to peacocks aren't very aviary. They can glide to an extent, but they actually don't fly tremendously long distances. Along with that, they have one of the most unique evasive abilities in all of nature of their confusion and disorientation technique, which also works to attract mates as well. I myself have actually been hit by this technique by a peacock in person, and let me just say, it does work. Whenever you just kind of stand there, if a peacock feels threatened, it will open up its large tail feathers, and it'll release these big swirly patterns at you. And the way that the peacock moves is actually very subtle, but it actually shakes its body just a little bit to actually give motion to these things, and it is actually fairly disorienting. It's a very unique technique, and just such a variety, such a departure from standard aviary, constructs. It's really fascinating. Right on that same topic, I definitely want to talk about some sea life again. Specifically, I find that the interesting relation for clownfish and sea anemones are just sort of a weird case of two things that just sort of stick together. It's really fascinating if you take the time to invest in that. It's sort of similar to how the peacock can disorient its enemies while at the same time, use that to attract as well. It's interesting to see how a symbiotic relationship can form between two relatively defenseless creatures, just sort of living off of each other, because nature really is that fascinating in a lot of regards. There are a lot of other interesting specimens of animals. I can't get into all of them, but I've already talked a little bit about the aardvark and other knuckle walkers like the echidna and why they walk on their knuckles, and it's actually really fascinating when you observe it. But they walk on their knuckles. It looks like they have small hands, but their front two claws, if you were to take, make a number 2 with your hands, put up 2 fingers like you're, making scissors, and you were to walk with 2 fingers out like that, then you would have 2 long claws that these creatures use to dig out. And it's a very fascinating, method, because that's how they dig, that's how they might attack as well. And it's interesting about lots of little things that some of these animals can do. Along with that, I definitely wanted to mention flamingos. They're very unassuming animals, but for one main reason, they're pink. People wonder why they pink. Oh, well, that's because birds are always crazy colors, or because it's to help attract mates. Not entirely. Flamingos are pink simply because of what they eat, and a lot of their diet consists of shrimp. Yeah. So they get their proteins mainly from shrimps or other animals as such, and their pink starts to come out through the pigmentation in their from their meals and their feathers, and that's mainly why they're pink. There's probably more detailed reasons as to why, but from my experience, that's a pretty good part of it. They eat a lot of shrimp. They just kind of skim the bottom of the water and eat shrimp, and it's fascinating. There's so much interesting dimorphism in a lot of animals. You may look at, say, how some wild cats, the different varieties of cats can have such vastly difference. There's a really good example of this. I'm gonna take just a moment of this, but I'm a big video game fan, and something recently that they've incorporated into the Pokemon games is regional variants of Pokemon. I'm not gonna get into detail right now, but there are some Pokemon that are exactly the same, except they come from different regions, so they've changed in some way, shape, or form. So it actually reflects real life as well, which I find that to be a really fascinating concept if looked at deep enough. You know, you may look at, let's say, the river otter and the sea otter, and how they may have some differences. Perhaps the sea otter might be bigger because it has more food and it might have to swim longer distances. You know, you have animals that do very similar or very different things, but are only differing by like very little amounts, and that's something that really can fascinate me. And then there are animals that do things that other animals don't do at all, and they're so vastly different, and yet it works for both of these species on tremendously different levels that you just don't expect. You don't expect that to work in nature, but it does. There are a lot of examples of this, but it would take a whole another episode to get in on any of that stuff, and I want to save some for later. But what I will say is that no matter what the case is, when it comes to nature, when it comes to animals, it's definitely wise to take some time to learn about the nature around us, and to really stop and think. Animals are unique in every way, shape, and form, and we as people have the amazing capability to understand that and to get to observe it. One place I definitely think a lot of people don't spend enough time in is the aquarium, to get to see how fascinating a lot of our fishy friends are and what makes them so special, what's so unique about the creatures in the deep. So I definitely recommend checking out your local aquarium at some point, and just really getting to observe some of these animals. If your aquarium has sea otters, or especially if they have any type of squid or jellyfish, those are really fascinating creatures. And if you're lucky enough and your aquarium has octopi, then you are in for a treat getting to learn about those creatures. But there are so many interesting things that creatures do that even I am still surprised to find out about. But this is definitely one of the places, and of course you'll always see very energetic and very fascinating creatures. So my advice this week is simply check out an aquarium, you know, especially if they have a rehabilitation or a conservation program. Most do, and it's to help protect the sea life, and you get to learn a little bit more about what those creatures we rarely get to see can do. And hopefully you find out some new kooky facts about creatures. Sea otters are definitely, like I said, very smart. People don't give them enough credit. They're very social creatures, and if you're lucky, you'll get to experience some of that social connection at the aquarium. If you ever want to talk more about animals, you're always welcome to comment, reach out, and just share your love of animals and pets. Next podcast, I plan to bring out something really fun and different, so I hope you guys enjoy. Along with that, I'd like to thank you for listening to the GSMC Pets Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd also like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write us a nice review. It really helps us out. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And thank you, and have a great day, guys.
You've been listening to the GSMC Pets Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's podcast.